So let's lay the foundation here for people who are new to logic, because I know a lot of people just haven't even heard of what logic is. I mean, there's even goofs out there that make fun of people that bring up logical fallacies, as if not having a valid as if not having a valid argument based in reality is a good thing, because you don't want to deal in fallacies, because that'll expose the clueless goof. I mean, it's kind of hilarious how many people out there just don't want to even address logical fallacies. So let's just go straight to the dictionary. Webster's definition of logic: a science that deals with the principles and criteria of validity. The science of the formal principles of reasoning, branch of a variety of logic. Formal principles of a branch of knowledge, a particular mode of reasoning. Okay. So basically, if you are concerned with validity, what is valid, what is not valid, for people who don't know the definition of valid, let's go to Webster's again. So it's either legal efficacy or force, or well-grounded or justifiable, being relevant and meaningful, logically correct, or appropriate to the end in view, okay? So this is just dealing with reality, what's valid or what's not valid. So if you're bringing up faulty logic or just hallucinations or blind faith, obviously that's not valid. Just like someone citing to the Bible to try to prove God, or citing to a priest at a church, because other individuals don't necessarily even believe in that religion, but even if they do, those are not valid modes of reasoning. For appeal to authority, obviously all of these things, which I will actually give a quick rundown of logical fallacies right now. So logical fallacies are basically errors in reasoning. The formal definition here, Webster: a fallacy, a false or mistaken idea, erroneous character. So errors or falsities. Okay, so these do need to be exposed, because if anyone is concerned with the truth, particularly if you're dealing in science or physics or anything that's observable reality, observable, testable, again, the scientific method, why would you allow false or mistaken ideas? So for the purpose of this debate, we will actually be having a fallacy counter to see if either one of these goofs gets completely obliterated in formal debate. I mean, people are welcome to give their predictions now. For those that have not seen this debate, is the flat earther Dave Weiss side, is Dave Weiss, the flat earther, going to get demolished and obliterated? Or is it going to be Professor Dave, who's not actually a professor, the globe earther, going to get demolished and wrecked completely? Let's see. So let's do a quick rundown of actual fallacies. So, of course, the strawman logical fallacy, one of the most popular. So basically a misrepresentation of someone's argument to make it easier to attack. By exaggerating, misrepresenting, or just completely fabricating someone's argument, it's much easier to present your own position as being reasonable, but this kind of dishonesty serves to undermine an honest, rational debate. So this, of course, is one of the most popular ones. False cause fallacy. I mean, this is a really popular one. A presumption that a real or perceived relationship between things means that one is the cause of the other. Many people confuse correlation, things happening together or in sequence, for causation, that one thing actually causes the other to happen. Sometimes correlation is coincidental, or it may be attributable to a common cause. Now, I'm just going to say this right now just to preempt, though. For example, the people arguing that gravity is the cause of things falling, if it's actually electromagnetism, and it pulls the electromagnetic charge is 9.8 meters per second squared, the fact that something falls is not proof that a bigger object attracts a smaller object. I mean, and a lot of these fallacies are combinations of multiple fallacies. They're linked together. Red herrings, hasty generalizations. I mean, a lot of these get roped in together. So that's, I mean, to try to keep it simple. I don't know how I'm going to count if something is two fallacies in one. I mean, I don't know. Maybe we'll count that. We'll see how it goes. Again, this is my first time doing a counter for fallacies in a debate, but I'll probably do it from now on just so it can be more clear which side argues completely fallaciously and which side does not, regardless of what the real truth is. I think I'm gonna have to keep reiterating that just there's so many goofs out there that just get triggered at the very notion of examining arguments instead of conclusion. I mean, so many silly goofs out there. But yeah, the false cause, definitely an issue. Appeal to emotion, basically an attempted manipulated emotional response in place of a valid or compelling argument. These are, of course, stacked on top of logical fallacies. Appeals to emotion include appeals to fear, envy, hatred, pity, pride, and more. It's important to note that sometimes a logically coherent argument may inspire emotion or have an emotional aspect, but the problem and fallacy occurs when emotion is used instead of a logical argument, or to obscure the fact that no compelling rational reason exists for one's position. Everyone bar sociopaths is affected by emotion, and so appeals to emotion are a very common and effective argument tactic, but they're ultimately flawed, dishonest, and tend to make one's opponents justifiably emotional. For example, in the gun control debate, I mean, people randomly throw out, oh, you want school children to die. That's your justification. I mean, that's also a straw man, obviously, and an appeal to emotion. I mean, it's insane how that's used as an argument when, well, the other thing that's also kind of weird is if you look at the amount of governments that have killed their own citizens after confiscating their weapons, I mean, you're talking hundreds of millions of people. Now, obviously, one life lost is too many when you're talking school children, or children, school-aged children, but millions and tens of millions of school-aged children were killed by governments after they confiscated weapons. So if you want to appeal to emotion, I mean, you could, there's a much more accurate and apt appeal to emotion if you look at for the pro gun side, just based on the fact that the amount of school-aged children killed after governments restricted firearms for the populace. So again, appeal to emotion is very common in that debate as well. Or even in certain medical treatments. Oh, you want everybody to die. Never mind that there's no evidence that the treatment actually works, or the treatment, the proposed treatment might actually make everything worse and kill even more people. But obviously the goofs engaging in appeal to emotional logical fallacies, they're obviously not concerned with actual facts or statistics. Now, the fallacy is interesting. I don't know how, it's not brought up often enough. But basically, the fallacy is a presumption that a claim has been poorly argued, that the claim itself must be wrong. So this is why I'm not dealing in conclusions, because if Flat Earth Dave here is correct about the Flat Earth model and he argues fallaciously, that doesn't mean he's wrong just because he's using fallacies. Just like Professor Dave here, he might be a complete and utter clueless buffoon with a mental disability with zero valid arguments, but he might accidentally hold the correct position of a heliocentric globe. So the fallacy is also important to keep in mind. The slippery slope logical fallacy, so this is also, there could be overlap here with the false cause. But the slippery slope states that if A happens, then Z will eventually happen too, therefore A should not happen. The problem with this reasoning is that it avoids engaging with the issue at hand and instead shifts attention to extreme hypotheticals. Because no proof is presented to show that such extreme hypotheticals will in fact occur, this fallacy is the form of an appeal to emotion fallacy by leveraging fear. In effect, the argument at hand is unfairly tainted by unsubstantiated conjecture. So this is actually popular with the climate grifters. So there's, with over 50 years of failed predictions by so-called climate scientists, they're actually scientists and priests. I mean, they were predicting an ice age in the 70s. Even the head of NASA's GISS, Jim Hansen, in 1988, He said that in 20 years, New York City's west side will be underwater. I mean, these goofs, their predictions are always wrong, and then they're trying to obviously do all these carbon taxes and line the pockets of the corrupt by appealing to emotion. Oh, our planet is going to be destroyed and we're all going to die. So, and obviously they're not, they interpret all the data to make it seem like there's actual warming. But again, if you look at the raw data, which is freely available on NOAA, you could see that there's actually 1 degree of cooling, and if you factor in a roughly 1 degree margin for error, because of course, there's no such thing as perfect technology and perfect measurements, I mean, there's basically been no difference. But if you look at even all of history, the amount of natural disasters and lives lost and property damage as a result of disasters, I mean, it's dropping so exponentially. It's just crazy. So obviously this slippery slope stacked on top of appeal to emotion, this is popular with the climate grift crowd. And again, that doesn't mean there's no actual climate change. Obviously the climate is always changing and there's always cycles. And the question is, does solar activity, does that control 99.999999999999999% of all climate on Earth? Therefore, any kind of carbon emission restriction, it would have no measurable effect. Now, if you're claiming it will have a measurable effect, obviously the burden of proof is on positive claims, and we'll get to the shifting the burden of proof logical fallacy in a moment. So the burden of proof basically trying to say that the claim doesn't lie with the person making the claim, but someone else has to disprove it. Now, this is popular, of course, for the moon landing cultists, those who worship at the Church of NASA. They claim that you have to prove that the landing didn't happen, and that it's not suspicious that thousands of reels of telemetry data of supposedly the greatest accomplishment in the history of mankind just accidentally lost, that the moon rocks that actually are allowed to be tested turn out to be petrified wood from Arizona. I mean, but none of that is suspicious, and it's still up to the scientifically skeptical who don't believe in these churches and corrupt institutions. It's up to them to disprove the moon landing instead of extraordinary claims requiring extraordinary evidence. Because, of course, one is not called upon to prove a negative. If someone claims there's a flying spaghetti monster in the sky and we all have to pay taxes to it, otherwise it's going to cause all the volcanoes to erupt and kill the earth, we're not just going to take that on faith. They have to prove it. Now, maybe it really is there. If it's an invisible interdimensional spaghetti monster, it might be there. I'm not saying it's not there. It's just there's no reason for someone to believe it unless the burden of proof is met. So burden of proof, of course, lies with someone making the claim, not upon anyone else to disprove. The inability or disinclination to disprove a claim does not render that claim invalid, nor does it give it credence whatsoever. However, it is important to note that we can never be certain of anything, so we must assign value to any claim based on available evidence, and to dismiss something on the basis that it hasn't been proven beyond all doubt is also fallacious reasoning. Again, that's why on Mind Shock, I do not claim anything is true or untrue. Now, obviously, the goofs hallucinate and strawman that I do, but obviously I don't. I say that explicitly. So, with Russell's teapot, Bertrand declares that a teapot at this very moment in orbit around the sun and between the Earth and Mars, and because no one can prove him wrong, his claim is therefore a valid one. But if he's claiming that, he must prove that. That's the whole point. And this is one of the fundamental fallacies, along with strawmanning and appeal to authority, that the gullible goofs who just believe everything they see on the idiot box. Now, Professor Dave here, I mean, I'm going to guess that he's going to have a whole lot of burden of proof fallacies, because he's hallucinating and pretending everybody should take on faith that all of these theories that he's purporting without supplying the evidence. Because if the theory is true, he should be able to clearly and succinctly prove why his house of cards is not a house of cards. Because if they're legitimate points and not a house of cards, because he's stacking theories upon theories, and then he's going to start name-calling, of course, which is an ad hominem logical fallacy, which also is one of the most popular fallacies. Ad hominem fallacy is basically an attack on the person. So you call them an idiot, you call them stupid, you can call them a liar. Even if those things are true, they have nothing to do with the argument. And so this fallacy, of course, instead of addressing the argument or position, it's an irrelevant attack on the person or an aspect of the person who is making the argument, or the attack can be made to a membership or group. For example, saying, well, you flat earthers are doing this, or you globe earthers are doing this. So this is also this can be tied into a hasty generalization logical fallacy as well. And a hasty generalization fallacy, also called an overgeneralization fallacy, is making a claim based on evidence that is too small. For example, you say, oh, well, all conspiracy theorists are crazy. So, yeah, obviously a certain amount of conspiracy theorists are crazy, but a hasty generalization logical fallacy would basically be, it's also related to a compositional logical fallacy, parts to a whole. Again, like I said, a lot of these fallacies are interrelated. We're gonna try to keep it as simple as possible, but this is Mindcheck, so I also want to be as accurate as possible. But, or saying like coincidence theorists are gullible goofs, or if you're a Church of NASA worshiper, you don't understand the scientific method. So obviously, a certain percentage of those goofs don't, but some of them might, and they're just either their cognitive dissonance or other issues, or they're just arguing dishonestly, would prevent them from addressing that. So hasty generalization, also a very common fallacy. So, also somewhat related is the tu quo qui logical fallacy. So, avoided engagement with criticism by turning the criticism back at the accuser. So, basically answering criticism with criticism. So, if someone points out an issue with a particular theory, the defender, instead of actually arguing that problem, they point out a problem on the other theory. So it doesn't defend their own position. They're just basically poking a hole in a completely separate theory. So this is also a relatively popular logical fallacy. It's also known as the U2 logical fallacy, or appeal to hypocrisy. It is commonly employed as an effective red herring because it takes the heat off someone having to defend their argument and instead shifts the focus back on the person making the criticism. This is a very cowardly debate tactic. If it's not, if the point has already been defended and the other person didn't understand it, then it can be effective, because if you've already made the defense of one particular model and the other person just didn't get it, either because of a mental deficiency or arguing dishonestly, then pointing out a similar issue might get the gears turning in their head or expose the hypocrisy. So it's not that they should never see. The thing is, these fallacies aren't fallacies unless they're used in place of an actual argument. So, for example, if one of these guys in this debate, either the flat earther or the globe earther, if they actually do address a point and argue effectively and then add on, you're an idiot, it's not a logical fallacy, because it's not used in place of the argument. Like, for example, when I call people Dunning-Kruger goofs, I clearly outline their deficiency in their fallacy and all points relevant here. And the Dunning-Kruger goof is simply an objective observation of their mental capacity. I don't use that in place of any kind of argument. I know that's an issue. A lot of people have a hard time with it. But yeah, so if you're using it in addition to, unlike instead of, then it's technically not a logical fallacy. So a red herring logical fallacy, obviously also related to the tu quo qui logical fallacy, but the red herring fallacy is kind of a broader umbrella where someone presents irrelevant information in an attempt to distract others from the topic at hand in order to avoid a question or shift discussion in a new direction. So if, again, they're arguing dishonestly, or they just might be incompetent, they're just throwing it out emotionally, if they recognize there's a weak part of an argument, they don't want to draw attention to it or defend it because they know it's weak and it doesn't hold up. So they're going to throw out red herring logical fallacy. So, for example, a lot of this can be used in the context of history where someone makes some kind of claim about the current situation and then someone else throws out, oh yeah, well it was like twice as bad, however many years ago, 50 years ago. That has almost nothing to do with the specific problem at hand and the specific variables in this specific situation. They're bringing up something that might possibly fall under the same umbrella, like a particular difficulty or, a current issue, a current problem. So it's not directly relevant. So that would be a red herring, also relatively popular. So moving the goalpost logical fallacy, or known as special pleading, also sometimes is referred to as raising the bar, because it's a constant adjustment of the argument when the specific parameters were actually met. So it's basically demanding from an opponent that he or she address more and more points after the initial counter-argument has been satisfied, refusing to concede or accept the opponent's argument. So issue A has been raised, adequately answered. Issue B raised, adequately answered. Issue Z raised, adequately answered. So they just keep coming up with more and more scenarios in an attempt to disprove the previous scenarios, which have already been addressed and validly argued against. So you could also do this with the gun control debate. For example, a civilian population would never be able to defeat a government army. So then, because you can't fight against fighter jets. Well, then the counterpoint, of course, fighter jets can't go door to door. You can't fly. Not to mention the expensive costs. There's so many issues with using fighter jets against the civilian population. Let's say a country the size of the United States, if that's where the argument is. Even if you have thousands of fighter jets just indiscriminately carpet bombing all the cities with infrastructures that the government would need, they wouldn't do that. So the F-15s go out of it. Then they start saying, oh, well, a civilian can't fight against a tank. Well, again, how many tanks do you have and how can they be maneuvered? Not to mention, obviously, without even getting into like foreign governments would, of course, take sides. So there'd be, you could, looking at Ukraine again, there's so many foreign governments providing money and arms to the civilians. Whereas if the civilians were completely unarmed and there was no military defending Ukraine, they would have just been ridden clean over. Again, you could look at the example, then they say, okay, well, assault rifles, that's not going to do anything against a fighter jet. Well, obviously, but the fighting is not going to take place with the fighter jets. So, every step of these silly arguments, not to mention a portion of if there was some kind of war within the United States where the U.S. government turned against its citizenry, 100% of the U.S. military would not turn against the citizenry. There would be a rebellious faction, so they would have X amount of equipment. Not to mention, there are militias who do have tanks and some more advanced weapons and howitzers and all these things. I don't know about fighter jets. And then they would shift the goalposts again, saying, well, what about nuclear weapons? Well, now you could also address that, because are they going to nuke? If they're based in D.C. and New York and L.A., are they going to nuke their own bases? Obviously they wouldn't do that. Not to mention, are they again going to indiscriminately drop 50 million nukes all over every single countryside and just destroy the whole U.S. just to kill its own citizens? Obviously they want to have a country, so that argument doesn't work either. So then they'll just keep continuing to come up with scenarios, and even if you can address each scenario, they'll just keep coming up with more. So this kind of special pleading or moving the goalpost, it is also used by the anti-gun crowd. Another interesting write-up here on special pleading: humans are funny creatures and have a foolish aversion to being wrong. Rather than appreciate the benefits of being able to change one's mind through better understanding, many will invent ways to cling to old beliefs. One of the most common ways that people do this is to post-rationalize a reason why what they thought to be true must remain true. It's usually very easy to find a reason to believe something that suits us, and it requires integrity and genuine honesty with oneself to examine one's own beliefs and motivations without falling into the trap of justifying our existing ways of seeing ourselves and the world around us. Next fallacy here, loaded question. The loaded question logical fallacy. You asked a question that has a presumption built into it, so that it couldn't be answered without appearing guilty. And this is also connected to a circular reasoning logical fallacy, which I'll get to in a moment. But the loaded question is particularly effective at derailing rational debates because of their inflammatory nature. The recipient of the loaded question is compelled to defend themselves and may appear flustered or on the back foot. So, a funny example listed here on pesec.no. Example: Grace and Helen were both romantically interested in Brad. One day, with Brad sitting within earshot, Grace asked in an inquisitive tone whether Helen was still having problems with her drug habit. That's an interesting example there. So here's the thing. That could also be built into a circular reasoning logical fallacy, because if there's no evidence that Helen even has a drug habit, and you see this kind of dishonesty all the time, so I will address that next with the circular reasoning logical fallacy. So circular reasoning, sometimes interchangeably used with begging the question. I mean, there are slight differences. Again, for the sake of brevity, I'm just going to do a super quick overview here. So to beg the question is to assume what we are trying to prove, and the conclusion is stated or assumed in the premises. For example, God exists because the Bible says so. The Bible is true because it is the Word of God. So this kind of it's also kind of an appeal to faith in a way, because, for example, someone says, oh, well, NASA is the official space agency, and they said this, they went to the moon, therefore the astronauts went to the moon, they also said they went to the moon, they work for NASA, NASA wouldn't lie, therefore it's true. But if someone doesn't believe in NASA, similarly, someone doesn't believe in the Bible, you can't use the Bible to prove something is true just because it's in the Bible. That's why it's a circular reasoning logical fallacy. So this logically incoherent argument arises in situations where people have an assumption that is very ingrained. Therefore, taken in their minds as a given, circular reasoning is bad mostly because it's not very good. So, for example, if somebody is using gravity to prove something else, they can't comprehend that if gravity is an unproven theory, it's not mass attracting mass, but, for example, electromagnetism, they will never address that because they're either that mentally deficient or they're arguing dishonestly. So they'll say, well, how does gravity work on this? But if gravity is not working by mass attracting mass, then that question isn't valid to begin with. So obviously, this is also a very popular one. We're going to see it a lot. Another relatively popular one is anecdotal. Anecdotal logical fallacies are personal experiences or isolated examples instead of sound arguments or compelling evidence. Also, see, statistics, in order to have meaningful statistics, like, let's say you know somebody who got shot in the head point blank and survived, you can say, well, guns aren't that deadly. I know a guy who got shot in the head point blank and he survived. That's an anecdotal example. I mean, yeah, it might be true. Nobody's debating that, but that doesn't mean that 99% or more than 99% of the time somebody shot in the head with a gun is gonna die, therefore guns are deadly. Even if you know two people that got shot in the head, or you know a couple people who were shot not in the head and they all survived, so you're saying, well, guns technically aren't that deadly because I know these couple of people that survived. That's, of course, an anecdotal logical fallacy. It's often much easier for people to believe someone's testimony as opposed to understanding complex data and variation across a continuum. Quantitative scientific measures are almost always more accurate than personal perceptions and experiences, but our inclination is to believe that which is tangible to us and or the word of someone we trust over a more abstract statistical reality. Also, of course, with you could use this example with other things like cigarettes or certain medical treatments where somebody might get the medical treatment and they don't die, therefore they declare the medical treatment safe. And of course, they could have gotten simply a saline solution instead of the actual medical treatment, and they wouldn't have known the difference, because how would they know either way? And then they claim it is safe because them and their family and everybody they know got the specific medical treatment while ignoring all the people who died from side effects of the medical treatment. The middle ground logical fallacy, I mean, this one's not extremely popular, but you do see it kind of stating, oh, well, we do need certain types of medical treatments, so therefore these corrupt big pharmaceutical companies, they can't be completely useless. There's a place for them. We need a certain amount. But if technically all of their products do more harm than good, even if they're technically effective in certain ways, the damage they cost, there's no net benefit, it's always a deficit, then you don't need them. The truth is not always in the middle, and that's pretty much the middle ground logical fallacy. And people as children, a lot of times they hear, oh, well, the truth is in the middle. I mean, no. I mean, sometimes in personalized account and subjective perceptions of an event, sometimes people who are arguing dishonestly with their ego, they're going to try to make themselves look good. So in those select situations, the truth might be in the middle. But in general, scientifically, in terms of actual reality and data, the truth is not always in the middle. So the middle ground logical fallacy is basically that a compromise or a middle point between two extremes must be the truth. Obviously, not necessarily. Much of the time, the truth does indeed lie between two extreme points, but this can bias our thinking. Sometimes a thing is simply untrue, and a compromise of it is also untrue. Halfway between truth and a lie is still a lie. Another relatively popular logical fallacy is the cherry-picking logical fallacy, or the fallacy of incomplete evidence. When using only select evidence in order to persuade the audience to accept a position, and evidence that would go against the position is withheld. The stronger the withheld evidence, the more fallacious the argument. I'll bring up gun control again, because this is such an easy one to fall for fallacies, where basically all of the people say, oh, well, guns are dangerous. Look at all these people killed by guns, while ignoring, at least in the United States, the millions of lives saved by guns. So the millions of instances where criminals were repelled by the presence of a gun. So if you didn't have that presence, I mean, you could be looking at a lot more deadlier situations. So that's a really big critical data point that the anti-gun nuts always ignore, the amount of lives saved. So they hallucinate that by removing guns from law-abiding citizens, or making it more difficult for law-abiding citizens to get guns. Obviously, criminals don't follow law, so that wouldn't affect the criminals getting their guns on the black market or otherwise. So this kind of withheld evidence is so extreme, because not only do they hallucinate that lives would have been saved anyway, as if a crazed killer wouldn't use a handgun if they didn't have an AR. Obviously, handguns are primarily used to kill people in the United States, but also school-aged children. So they only look at mass shootings, and they ignore single incident shootings, which claim thousands and thousands of more lives than isolated mass shootings. Not that isolated mass shootings aren't horrible. Obviously they are. A single life lost is horrible. But having countless single life lost situations ignored to try to focus only on particular, as if the anti-gun nuts only seem to care about children killed in school or mass shootings, and they don't care about individual gun murders, like in these capitals, gun murder capitals like Baltimore and Chicago and all these cities where they have the most restrictive gun laws, which obviously only causes an increase in crime because only the criminals have the guns there, and they feel more comfortable to act with impunity because they know most of the population will be unarmed. Whereas if you look at countries where they have an armed populace and there's a lot of guns in the hands of law-abiding citizens, they statistically have the lowest gun homicide rates. And then you could also look at countries that have banned guns, and you can see their murder rates and criminal rates spike right after because the criminals are emboldened. I mean, this isn't rocket science. Criminals don't follow laws. I don't know why it's difficult to understand, but these cherry-picking logical fallacies are really popular in gun control debates as well. Another logical fallacy that's really popular by globe earthers and some flat earthers is the reification logical fallacy. This is a fallacy that does not get talked about, but it's really, really important. Reification is a logical fallacy that results from treating an abstraction as a concrete thing. It is associated with taking ideas too far until they become rigid and oppressive. A concrete thing is undeniable and measurable. Treating your abstract thoughts in the same way tends to be illogical. A commonly cited example of reification is the treatment of intelligence testing scores as if they were the concrete and universal definition of intelligence. Intelligence is an abstraction that is difficult to define and measure. So there's a couple different ways to do this. I mean, some people, again, this can be tied to appeal to authority, the appeal to authority logical fallacy, which I'll go over next, but basically saying, oh, well, the higher the degree, the smarter the person, and as if that's a concrete. Because obviously, indoctrinated goofs that jump through hoops like circus animals for treats like degrees, they actually are really good at regurgitation and submissively doing what their masters in the indoctrination facilities tell them to do in order to get their doctorate or masters. A lot of the time, they're Dunning-Kruger's off the charts because they assume and hallucinate that obedience is somehow related to intelligence while inside an indoctrination facility. Because if you look at throughout the past generations, I mean, the majority of everything that's taught in schools, aka indoctrination facilities, it's either wrong, it's either completely wrong or partially wrong. I mean, you could look at any subject other than English grammar and basic math. Everything else has been either completely or partially wrong or propagandized in some fashion. So they're learning all these theories. Look at the theories that were prevalent 100 years ago versus now in psychology, in archaeology. I mean, all the sciences. I mean, everything is changing. So it's really silly to believe in this logical fallacy. Another point that's made, this is tied to a compositional logical fallacy. So the compositional logical fallacy basically infers that something is true of the whole from the fact that it's true of some part of the whole. So this would be the opposite of the fallacy of division. The fallacy of division is inferring that something is true of one or more of the parts from the fact that it is true of the whole. So if A is part of B, then B has property X, therefore A has property X. Example, his house is about half the size of most houses in the neighborhood, therefore his doors must all be about 3.5 feet high. Of course, quite silly. So the fallacy of composition is the opposite of that. Something is true of the whole from the fact that it is true of some part of the whole. So A is part of B, A has property X, therefore B has property X. Example, each brick in that building weighs less than a pound, therefore the building weighs less than a pound. Or hydrogen is not wet, oxygen is not wet, therefore water, H2O, is not wet. So again, with these compositional logical fallacies, they can also be tied to the hallucination of the causal logical fallacy. So basically, just because part of something is true, the whole is true, or just because something was started, it was finished. For example, if you see a rocket launch, that must mean they went to the moon because the rocket launched. I mean, that's pretty silly. So if you can prove you left your driveway, that doesn't mean you drove from New York to LA just because there's a bunch of witnesses of you leaving LA. So this is all quite silly, of course. Going back just for a second to the reification logical fallacy, a lot of times this is all tied together where the abstract is hallucinated to affect everything. For example, people that claim that the Earth is a globe because gravity affects everything. So then they'll rope in, oh, well, what about satellites? What about all of these things that prove gravity? So they're tying in the circular reasoning logical fallacy with the reification logical fallacy, as well as compositional logical fallacies, creating the illusion that all of these pieces are interdependent and based on theories that have already been proven. Obviously, they could be working that way for completely different reasons than assumed. And that's where the burden of proof logical fallacy comes in, because they have to prove each point independently instead of hallucinating and roping in all of these points together. So the last two fallacies we're going to go over is the appeal to authority logical fallacy. So just because an authority thinks something, therefore it must be true. It's important to note that the fallacy should not be used to dismiss the claims of experts or scientific consensus. Appeals to authority are not valid arguments, but nor is it reasonable to disregard the claims of experts who have demonstrated a depth of knowledge. Okay, now here's the problem with this. There's experts on both sides of every issue ever. For example, anti versus pro. Nobody's an anti because they believed somebody living in their mom's basement posting a GeoCities blog. It's because these accomplished doctors published all these books and papers arguing against the use of. So there's doctors on both sides of the issue. That's where conflict of interest also comes in, because obviously the doctors paid by the pharmaceutical companies would be more likely to endorse those products, especially if they're getting kickbacks. And this has all been obviously proven to the tune of billions of dollars in court documents. I've posted these links all the time. You could look at the court cases. I mean, for example, Pfizer is the most fined pharmaceutical company in history with billions in fines for fraud. Now, again, that doesn't mean their products don't work. That just means they have billions ruled against them for fraud. Make of that what you will. Appeal to authority also, for example, in the tobacco industry, paid off a bunch of doctors and scientists saying that cigarettes are safe. But you also had doctors on the other side. This is why this fallacy is so silly, because there's experts on both sides of every issue. So you're basically just citing to an opinion. Also, this is kind of like an appeal to faith, to blind faith. Because this NASA priest said this, it must be true. Very silly, just like a priest at a church. Just because they said something doesn't mean it's true. Just because they claim to talk to God, that doesn't mean they actually do and have the actual real knowledge of anything. There's actually we got to go over a couple more fallacies. No True Scotsman logical fallacy, relatively popular. You made what could be called an appeal to purity as a way to dismiss relevant criticisms or flaws of your argument. In this form of faulty reasoning, one's belief is rendered unfalsifiable, because no matter how compelling the evidence is, one simply shifts the goalpost so that it wouldn't apply to a supposedly true example. This kind of post-rationalization is a way of avoiding valid criticisms of one's argument. Example, Angus declares that Scotsmen do not put sugar on their porridge, to which Lachlan points out that he is a Scotsman and puts sugar on his porridge. Furious, like a true Scot, Angus yells that no true Scotsman sugars his porridge. So this kind of added subjectivity. And mostly just, again, roping in anecdotal logical fallacies and all these things. A lot of these fallacious arguments have multiple fallacies as components in them, which is why it's important to understand all of them. There's actually a couple more. Genetic logical fallacy. You judge something as either good or bad on the basis of where it comes from or from whom it came. This is actually one of the most popular logical fallacies. Perhaps I should have started with it. This fallacy avoids the argument by shifting focus onto something or someone's origins. It's similar to an ad hominem fallacy in that it leverages existing negative perceptions to make someone's argument look bad without actually presenting a case of why the argument itself lacks merit. The most popular example of this is those with Trump derangement syndrome. Any argument they don't like or don't even want to process, they'll just say, oh, well, that person's a Trump supporter. So somebody could be screaming, 1 + 1 is 2. Nah, that's not true. They're a Trump supporter because they're wearing a MAGA hat. Or the argument I used to give before Trump derangement syndrome was a thing is, let's say a homeless bum druggie screaming on the street corner, 1 + 1 is 2. You say, oh, well, they're a homeless druggie. You can't trust what they say, even if they're screaming the ABCs in the actual correct order. Their argument is legitimate. They're saying something is true, but you're not even going to listen to the argument based on who they are. That is a genetic logical fallacy. Very, very silly. Another very popular fallacy, black or white logical fallacy, also known as the false dichotomy logical fallacy. You presented two alternative states as the only possibilities, when in fact more possibilities exist. Also known as the false dilemma, this insidious tactic has the appearance of forming a logical argument, but under closer scrutiny it becomes evident that there are more possibilities than the either-or choice that is presented. Binary, black or white thinking doesn't allow for the many different variables, conditions, and contexts in which there would exist more than just the two possibilities put forth. It frames the argument misleadingly and obscures rational, honest debate. So again, within the flat earth sphere, the heliocentric globe believers will always say, oh, well, if the earth's flat, where's the edge? Or the Earth is flat, and yet all the other planets are spheres. I mean, this of course goes into straw manning as well. Again, a lot of times these fallacies overlap. But black and white logical fallacies, relatively popular. A lot of people use them. And of course, very, very silly. Another popular one from coincidence theorists and authority worshipping cultists. Oh, if the conspiracy is true, everybody's lying? Obviously not. All those people, a lot of people are fallible, or they just trust the corrupt. So they're not knowingly lying. They're saying what they believe is true. Therefore, they're not lying. But the dishonest authority worshipping cultists and coincidence theorists, they're either that mentally deficient that they can't even consider the possibility that humans are fallible and humans make mistakes. It's really weird. But these goofs always hallucinate that if there were a conspiracy, that would mean all these people or entities would have to be in on it, and there's absolutely no way. They could just simply be following orders, believing that the orders are legitimate, and that whatever they are presenting is actually true, when in fact it is not. And this is obviously how all the successful conspiracies are carried out, because you would want as few people in on it as possible, because everything just works easier that way. So these are basics. Another popular logical fallacy: appeal to incredulity or personal incredulity. Because you found something difficult to understand or are unaware of how it works, you made out like it's probably not true. Again, very popular in flat earth debate. A lot of heliocentric globe believers say, oh, well, what would the reason be for a flat earth cover-up? I don't see the reason. I don't see the motive. I don't see the motive. Therefore, it's not true. So these goofs appeal to their own ignorance and mental deficiency in not understanding the argument. Now, again, I'm not saying flat earthers are correct about anything, but if the reason was that good, and again, I'm not classifying, like, if flat earth is true, I am not saying any of the flat earthers have the motives correct for any kind of government cover-ups, even if it is true. Because a lot of conspiracies, alien, some of these Illuminati conspiracies, unless you have all these top level clearances to know what the truth is, how would you know what the motive was, even if the conspiracy is true? And some of these far-reaching conspiracies that some find incredibly incredulous, the motive would have to be highly classified. Because if the motive was that easily well known, there'd be no reason for the cover-up. So again, this is something these authority-worshipping cultists and coincidence theorists, they're so mentally deficient, they can't even understand these basic children's level logical fallacies. The last fallacy we're going to go over here is the bandwagon logical fallacy, or the appeal to popularity. This is also relatively a popular logical fallacy as well. So, appeal to popularity, or the fact that many people do or believe something as an attempted form of validation. The flaw in this argument is that popularity of an idea has absolutely no bearing on its validity. And the irony here is that a lot of, again, within the flat earth debate, a lot of the globe earthers say, oh, well, everybody believes it's a globe, therefore it's a globe. But in the past, however far you want to go back, if the majority believed it was flat, did that make it flat? Or once upon a time, when the majority of people believed that smoking was not harmful to your health, including experts. I mean, of course, appeal to popularity and appeal to authority often get roped in together as well to make it look like a more legitimate argument. But again, if you just look throughout history, the majority of things, the majority of people believed throughout the majority of history have been wrong. That's where the old adage comes from: nothing popular is true, nothing true is popular. Now, obviously, there's exceptions to that as well, but that's just a general rule of thumb, because if you look generationally, every generation, there's a lot of beliefs that switch because you figure that more information is gained, because there's always missing pieces. There's always variables. Actually, there was one more fallacy that we might as well list because we went through so many already. Appeal to ignorance. This is related to the shifting the burden of proof logical fallacy, but not exactly. So, appeal to ignorance is a logical fallacy that occurs when someone claims that a conclusion must be true if it hasn't been proven false, or false if it hasn't been proven true. The burden of proof logical fallacy is mostly just regarding positive claims. This is regarding either stance. So appeal to ignorance is a logical fallacy in which someone argues either for or against something because there is no contradicting evidence. In other words, it's based on the mistaken assumption that a lack of evidence is evidence. One falls victim to this fallacious line of reasoning when they assert that a claim must be true if it hasn't proven false, or false if it hasn't been proven true. Ignorance, or the lack of opposing evidence, is the main premise for the argument, hence the name appeal to ignorance. Now, this is really, really tricky for some, but I'm going to attempt to break it down as simple as possible. So this is also related to falsification is not dependent on replacement. It's independent of replacement. So if you can falsify something, you don't need to replace it with something else. A lot of goofs, especially in scientific debates, for whatever reason, they say, well, if you can't come up with something else, we're going to keep going with this. I mean, that is so dumb. Let's say you're a police detective and you only have one suspect and they have motive, means, and opportunity, maybe. But then you come across some evidence that disqualifies them as a suspect, but you can't come up with any other suspects. So you just continue going with them. Well, it still must be them. Even though all of a sudden an alibi came up. Oh, well, they showed up on some security footage. Maybe it's doctored, maybe it's not. Well, it doesn't have to be them simply because they're not aware of other suspects. Especially if you poke enough holes where you disprove that it's them, or there's enough doubt that there's a strong possibility it's not them. There's simply nothing but really vague circumstantial evidence that won't hold up in any court of law. But because you're ignorant of any other possible theories, that doesn't mean everybody just needs to go with that one. This is also popular in flat earth debate, where people say, oh, well, if you can't come up with a better theory, you have to just keep going with the theory that has so many holes. This is actually used by both flat earthers and globe earthers, so it's an interesting one.